at the Cooper City Church of God and Baptist Church of Sunrise, and of course, Imam Dr. Nasser Ahmad of Al Ansar Mosque, whom I have known for perhaps over 25 years. Almost exactly a year ago, we had our panel at the iconic Al Ansar Mosque celebrating Black History Month, and a lot has happened since February 2020. The COVID crisis disrupted our lives, and the pandemic, almost 500,000 Americans have already lost their life, and predictably, and not surprisingly, and somewhat related to our subject, most disproportionately African Americans lost their lives. The same year, and in spite of the pandemic, which is remarkable, America also witnessed the unbelievable reintroduction of a nationwide demand for racial equality and justice. The Jaffer Center has been committed to pursuing both the academic and the public policy discussion of the race and justice issue, both at FIU and in the community. Hopefully next year we will meet again and more often, and inshallah in person. Professor Alvarez have asked me several times to make sure that we all be brief in our introductions, and then I'm looking forward to have very productive discussions among the panelists, and then a Q&A sessions. Thank you very much. Professor Alvarez, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Mesbahi. We're going to keep the introduction short. Dr. Mesbahi already introduced the panelists. I just wanted to mention I am Dan Alvarez. I am a senior instructor in religious studies, and I am also a fellow of the Muslim World Studies Center. I'm very proud to be a part of this experience. I'm part of the contribution the Muslim World Studies Center is making, not only to this community, but the entire world, because we are a Muslim World Studies Center. While COVID-19 in many ways defined 2020, this was also a year marked by ongoing national, if not global, preoccupation with the struggle for racial justice and the challenges that it presents to both the policy and cultural dynamics of the 21st century America. This panel will look into the legal, historical, as well as the grassroots legacies and contributions of African Muslims in this struggle and the continuous national search for racial and economic justice in contemporary America. The panelists have already been introduced. The first panelist will be Saira Choudhury, professor of law at Florida International University. Professor Choudhury's talk will address the legal context and evolutionary dynamics of the African-American civil rights struggle, including Black Lives Matter and its implications and lessons for Muslim American civil rights. She will focus on how the three landmark Supreme Court cases advancing civil rights for African Americans establish greater equality for all Americans, including new immigrants. Dr. Choudhury, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be on this panel. It's a pleasure to be here and also to be a part of the center. And I am somebody who teaches in the law school, and my focus of both teaching and scholarship is Islamophobia and race and gender specifically. Today, I only have about 5 or 6 minutes. So the introduction laid out something that I could talk for about, an hour or so. So I'm going to actually try to do this as short a time as I can. And what I want to do is talk about the African-American civil rights struggle as it links to the lives of Muslims today, and how we have benefited from a long history of African-American struggles in which, of course, African-American Muslims have been an integral part. And I wanted to talk very quickly about these connections in the context of two cases. And there are hundreds of civil rights cases, all of which are incredibly important to equality and justice for Muslims today. But the two cases that I'm going to talk about are perhaps less well known than, for example, Brown v. Board of Education or Loving v. Virginia. The first is Smith v. Allwright, which is a decision made, sort of came down from the Supreme Court in 1944, very early on in the civil rights struggle, sort of the modern civil rights struggle. And this case essentially was a challenge to the all-white primaries in Texas. Now, you might not think that this is particularly relevant to us, but this case allowed people who were essentially cut out of voting in the primaries to vote in the primaries. So Texas had this law basically that it had a rule inside the Democratic Party that only white members of the Democratic Party were allowed to vote in the primaries. Now, the Democratic Party is a private enterprise. It's a private entity. And so the question arose as to whether or not the state was involved in this in any way at all, right? So the law that prohibits discrimination against minorities, 14th Amendment specifically, is really directed at state action. And so these are early cases testing to see what level of state action is involved in what looks to be a primarily private matter. So the Texas Democratic Party essentially argued that, we're a private entity, we make our own internal rules, and if we don't want to allow any of our Black members to vote in the primaries, that's perfectly legal. And the courts held that this was not legal. And in fact, that primaries were intimately related to the general election. And since Black voters could not be denied access to the general election, they could not be denied access to primaries. Think about this for a second in the context of why this matters now, and in the context of widespread voter suppression that we have seen in the past couple of elections. If you think about the ability to select who stands for election, that is the purpose of the primary. We get to pick who the candidate is going to be. If the Democratic Party was allowed to assert that this was essentially a private matter, then we could have Democratic parties, Republican Party, the Green Party, whoever, essentially just promote a particular candidate from a particular background. So in this case, it was white candidates, and we would have no choice but to vote for them or not vote in the general election. So by actually preventing white primaries, we opened up the primaries for the votes of African Americans, and this has democratized the election process really from the ground up, if you think about it. So why does this benefit Muslims? Because Muslims, we often think that Muslims are new immigrants in the United States, and for the vast majority of Muslims who have immigrated in the 1950s and 60s, the ability to participate in electoral politics has been shaped by these struggles that have been undertaken by African American activists and civil rights activists. Another case that I think is important to think about is Shelley v. Kramer. If you live in an old housing, an old neighborhood, you might consider looking at the history of that neighborhood to see whether or not you live in a neighborhood in which there were restrictive covenants. Restrictive covenants essentially are internal to the contract between buyers and sellers and the homeowners of a particular area that prohibit people from buying into that neighborhood depending on their race. So the way that we are most familiar with it is that African Americans were prohibited from buying into majority Black neighborhoods through these restrictive covenants. They are private contracts between buyers and sellers. And oftentimes what would happen is buyers and sellers would make the deal that they would sell, a white seller would sell to a Black purchaser. And then the neighborhood would, people from the neighborhood would bring a suit to void that sale and to enforce the restrictive covenants. And essentially this was a means of keeping up the segregated neighborhoods that were very prevalent in Jim Crow. So if you live in a community in which it's integrated, or you've moved into a primarily white community anywhere in the South, or in the North for that matter, because restrictive covenants were very common even in the North. Shelley v. Kramer, a case in which African Americans brought a pushed for fairer housing and pushed for the overturning of these restrictive covenants from being enforced, has given you the ability to actually buy and sell real estate and buy and sell houses, regardless of whether the restrictive covenant is in your contract or not. It's unenforceable. This case that was decided in 1948 was the precursor to the Fair Housing Act of the 25 years later, 24 years later, 1968, when we saw civil rights activists push very hard for the Civil Rights Act of 1968. We saw them push for fair housing, voting rights, etc. The Fair Housing Act then made it illegal for anyone to discriminate in the buying and selling of houses based on race, national origin, etc., if they were going to use a realtor. So these early struggles have allowed Muslim communities who have come post the civil rights movement, and even during the civil rights movement, greater access to the political process, the ability to live in communities of their choice, to the ability to marry, Loving v. Virginia, across racial lines, the ability to go to school of their choice, Brown v. Board of Education, and a whole host of other rights that we enjoy now because of the struggles of African Americans in the civil rights movement and earlier. How this relates to Black Lives Matters, let me just quickly tie this in. Post Ferguson, and in particularly sort of becoming very, very prominent in the summer of 2020, we saw a massive uprising with regard to racial justice in this country. If it is of incredibly, I cannot underscore the importance of being part of that struggle enough. Why? Because racial justice in this country affects Muslims very intimately. Almost all of the counterterrorism and police surveillance, etc., that we have seen happen at mosques and against Muslims come from a very old anti-Black playbook. So Black Lives Matters and their movement to bring reform to policing, to the criminal justice system, actually impacts all of us, because we as a community, along with our Black Muslim brethren, and generally our African American brethren and our friends and family, have been basically part of the same overall structure of policing. We've been subjected to the same sort of strategies of policing and regulation. And this struggle is actually our struggle as well, as we have seen with also the January 6th insurrection that happened in Washington, D.C. I was actually there watching this unfold in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that became very, very clear is that this movement that took place in Washington, D.C. was in some part in reaction to the Black Lives Matters, in reaction to the pressing of civil rights issues for minorities. And the response to that has got to be one that is undertaken by all minority communities in solidarity with each other. And so I think I probably am out of time.
One minute.
I have 1 minute. Oh, wow. That was, I'm good. So yeah, so I wanted to basically, just tie these things together. The fact that, civil rights activists from the African American communities have been fighting for a more, a better union, right? A more complete understanding of the notion of we the people that is part of our Declaration of Independence, a more complete and thorough sort of understanding of the constitutional rights that doesn't carve out certain groups of people for different treatment, right? So when we think about the 14th Amendment's equal protection of the law, what do we understand by equal protection? These civil rights cases, Shelley v. Kramer, Smith v. Allwright, and all the ones that I've talked about, along with the activism around police violence as well as criminal justice reform, is a move towards greater equality regardless of race and regardless of ethnicity and regardless of religion. And that is a struggle that we are all a part of. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Chaudhry. The next panelist will be Dr. Michael Knight, Associate Professor at the University of Central Florida. Professor Knight's talk will focus on Malcolm X's legacy and its immeasurable significance for American Muslim communities. He will touch upon the significance of Malcolm X for multiple Muslim thinkers and movements, as well as the contemporary reconstruction or reimagination of Malcolm X. And I do believe that Dr. Knight is coming out soon with a book on Malcolm X. Dr. Knight, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. And really, really thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. To talk about Malcolm X in 8 minutes is kind of an injustice, and the time constraints are what they are. So I'm going to be very, very short, and leave space for more questions and conversation as we go on. I want to call attention to what an extraordinary week this is in American Muslim history. So February 21st is the anniversary of the martyrdom of Malcolm X. The next day, February 22nd, is the birthday, or the born day, as is said, of a man who is known as Allah the Father, formerly Clarence 13X, a member of the Nation of Islam, who founded the 5%er movement in the 1960s, a movement that remains under legal state persecution in multiple parts of the country, particularly in the prison system, where 5%ers have had to fight in court for their constitutionally protected freedom of conscience. Today, the 25th, is the anniversary of the passing of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And tomorrow, the 26th, is the birthday of his teacher, Master Farad Muhammad, who the Nation of Islam identifies as the Mahdi and Allah in person. So my plan was to touch on Malcolm X's legacy, recognizing the extraordinary time constraints of doing that in 6 to 8 minutes or what have you. But I wanted to think of his legacy as part of another legacy, that of his teacher on the day of his passing, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. We often treat Malcolm as graduating from the nation or transcending the nation or outgrowing it and entering into this transnational globalism, universalism of classical, quote unquote, Orthodox Islam, as well as transnational freedom struggle. But he did so, to the extent that he did so as a student of Elijah Muhammad, coming from this tradition of the Nation of Islam. And even in his repudiation of it, still carried marks of that legacy as he traveled the world. We often erroneously think of the Nation of Islam as this weird local, very contextually specific kind of movement that one needs to transcend. It's useful as a rung on a ladder to something more global, more universal, more classical in terms of Islam. And we often think of Malcolm's Hajj as the mark of that, as the mark of Malcolm graduating from what his teacher had given him. What we leave out in these kinds of narratives is that Elijah Muhammad himself had gone to Mecca previously, prior to Malcolm. Elijah Muhammad had performed a pilgrimage, and Malcolm had been instrumental in setting that up for Elijah Muhammad. And that the Nation of Islam already had a transnational consciousness. It already had a kind of Islamic global consciousness. It did see itself in relation to a global classical Islamic tradition. Malcolm took that perhaps further than it could have gone, within its own theological constraints, because it had a very particular theology in terms of how it identified God's attributes and how to understand Islamic scriptural sources and that kind of thing. Malcolm did take the nation with him as he traveled, but he did so as a branch of that tree. So when he embarked on his pilgrimage to Mecca, he was out of the organization of the Nation of Islam officially, but said he did so as a student of Elijah Muhammad. He carried the name Shabazz that Elijah Muhammad had given him. This is a name from within Nation of Islam tradition. And even as he reconstructed himself in a kind of classical, quote unquote, Orthodox Islamic orientation, he carried these markers with him. He continued to use the name Malik Shabazz that had come from within the Nation of Islam. And it was the Nation of Islam's global Islamic consciousness, or its own narrative of a connection to that global Islamic consciousness, that kind of became a launch pad for Malcolm, even as he left it. So from its very, very beginnings, the Nation of Islam said, you are bigger than the narratives of American white supremacy and global white supremacy. And you have a nationhood, you have a sense of identity that extends beyond North America, beyond the constraints of this little island and its narratives about you. Master Farad Muhammad, the teacher of Elijah Muhammad, taught that they were part of a nation, really a nation of Islam that was older than the sun, moon, and stars, in his words, that this goes back trillions of years and has no birth record, that there is a transcendence beyond the narratives of white supremacy, a transcendence beyond the legal status, the religious status, the cultural status, the discursive status that Black people in the Americas had fallen into in this world of white supremacy. So in my own work, I do try to highlight these kinds of transnationalisms that exist outside of Malcolm's own particular journey, right? That Muslims in the Americas who had come through this tradition of the Nation of Islam, both before and after Elijah Muhammad, saw themselves as part of a bigger world already, right? They were already connecting to Muslims transnationally. They were connecting through their reading materials, through the, first and foremost, of course, through the Quran and how they accessed the Quran. But if you look, this will be kind of my final note here. You can look at the book catalogs from Akbar's Books and Things in New York, the bookstore affiliated to Mosque Number 7, and Nation of Islam Muslims in the 1960s, prior to their reorientation under Imam Muhyiddin Muhammad, they were reading Ghazali, they were reading Iqbal, they were reading Maududi. They were very much part of a global Islamic consciousness. That's how they saw themselves. These are the texts that they were accessing. So in my own work, I try to resist the narrative that the Nation of Islam represents this tiny little small weird thing in this corner, and then you have a big global monolithic classical Islam outside of it, and we judge the authenticity of someone by how much they can bridge out of the nation. The nation always saw itself as part of this global ummah and this larger tradition. So that's what I like to highlight in my work, especially on a day like this, because yes, it's the death anniversary of Elijah Muhammad, but it's also coincidentally this year the birthday of Imam Ali. So it may be a good day to celebrate those bridges and connections when we find them. So thank you again, and I look forward to further conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Knight. Now we turn to Honorable Judge Norman Hemming, Chief Administrative Law Judge and pastor of the Cooper City Church of God and the Baptist Church of Sunrise. Dr. Hemming, the floor is yours.
Yes, hi, good day. It's really, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here today and just to contribute among these scholars, because I'm clearly not a scholar. However, this is what I wanted to talk a little bit about. It's the fact that it's believed that by the 1690, 20% of all the slaves that were being brought to the New World, and in particular to the United States of America, would have already been Muslims. In fact, there would have been Muslims coming out of the Fulani tribe in West Africa. And it's a tribe that has many noted luminaries here in the US that impact us even to this to this very day. So there would have been people coming out of places like Guinea and Senegal and Guinea-Bissau and Sierra Leone, and even as far away as Nigeria. That would have been the Fula people or the Fulani peoples, and their impact on America and on civil rights is unmistakable. Because many of these people who came here, one of them, perhaps the most famous of them, would have been Omar ibn Saad, and he was most famous because of the book that he wrote. That initially his slave masters thought that they were just his diaries, but it turned out that he was actually writing as an educated Muslim man. But someone else that we hear very little about, but that we probably should pay some attention to, because Islam has taken such a great role in the United States, even though we talked about the 20% that came as slaves in the 1690s. Perhaps one of the earliest mosques that we have in the United States would have been in one of the most unlikeliest of places in Ross in South Dakota, that is listed as one of the oldest mosques in the US, dating back to as early as the year 1929. But then we also have mosques that also appeared apparently in Maine and in Connecticut as early as the year 1915. And in fact, one of the oldest mosques in existence today is at another place that you wouldn't expect to see mosques, right? Because you would be thinking of Michigan. But no, it's in 1934, the mosque in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. But this other Fulani member that is very little spoken about is this gentleman by the name of Bilali Muhammad. And Bilali Muhammad is important because of the fact that while he was enslaved on a plantation in Sapelo Island, Georgia, he actually came out of the Bahamas. That's where he was initially before he was sent over here to Georgia in the United States. But what the writings that he was able to put together, that once again people thought were just scribblings of a mad person, or perhaps just his own personal diaries, turned out to have been an Arabic manuscript on West African Islamic law. And one of the interesting things about him is that name Bilali, because it is believed that there was some corruption of that name Bilali for later African Americans who would have known themselves as being named Bailey. Now it's interesting because perhaps one of the foremost persons in terms of freeing people from slavery and making an anti-slavery argument in the United States would have been a gentleman that we all know as Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass, interestingly, also coming out of Georgia. Before he was named Frederick Douglass, we might not know this, but he actually assumed the name Douglass. The name of his mother and his original name was that last name, Bailey. And so it's believed that Frederick Douglass was, in fact, even though he's clearly a Christian, and I'm a Christian minister, right? It's believed that he was, in fact, a Muslim American at birth, right? And that last name, Bailey, is just really a miscegenation of his actual name, family name, which is Bilali, on his mother's side. Of course, his father, as we all know, was white. But it's interesting the role that Muslims have played in changing the landscape of America in legal terms and then also in practical terms. Because not only did he become the foremost proponent and advocate and a gifted orator with respect to the anti-slavery movement, but then there are others who also impacted us here in the United States. So we had, and you heard the learned professor talk to you about Malcolm X. But one of the things that is interesting about Malcolm X and the impact that he had as a Muslim on the American psyche, perhaps may have had something to do with the fact that his mother is actually of Caribbean descent, right? And she was actually from Grenada. So she would have come out of a family that would have come from countries in the Caribbean where they would have seen Black people going well along the way towards self-rule and self-governance. seeing Blacks serving as doctors and as lawyers and as different types of practitioners and as engineers, etc. So it wouldn't be far-fetched for someone coming out of that type of a background to come to the United States and to find himself aghast when seeing the type of incaltricence in terms of the white parts of the white community in how they viewed Blacks as being less than and not being able to, as the professor from the law school told us earlier, not being able to move into certain areas because of restrictive covenants. That would have been something that would have been anathema to anyone coming out of the Caribbean here to the United States. So it's not strange that after Malcolm was educated by Minister Elijah Muhammad, that his whole orientation and focus would have been on the upliftment of Black people in the United States. Not only upliftment in terms of changing their identity in terms of their religion, but I would posit that one of the things that he saw as almost equally important was the upliftment of the socioeconomic conditions that African Americans found themselves in, and that has filtered down even to today. Once again, coming out of that same Nation of Islam, another pragmatist, I believe that we may have seen, or that some may say is a pragmatist, would have been Minister Louis Farrakhan. And of course, Minister Louis Farrakhan, once again, coming out of that Caribbean background, right? So his mother was from St. Kitts and his father is of Jamaican heritage. So it's not surprising that Minister Louis Farrakhan would be one of the foremost spokespersons speaking out in favor of not seeing police brutality and of not seeing situations, unfortunately, in which Blacks are being held down by structural racism. So it's not strange that he would have become a voice for that. So once again, we see Islam, whether it's Bilal Muhammad, whether it's Malcolm X, or whether it's Minister Louis Farrakhan, playing an instrumental role in changing how it is that Americans saw justice and fought for civil rights and for freedom in the United States. And also not surprising that we would have seen someone like a Frederick Douglass and his history coming out perhaps as a Muslim at birth, also seeing that same struggle and participating in it. But what does that mean for us today in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and in terms of what we see happening on the American stage? Well, a number of things, right? So we see in the Caribbean, we had Indians coming from the subcontinent of India being brought in as indentured servants after the end of slavery in most of the British world, not here in the United States. That occurred later. And it's not surprising that some 503 years after the first slave would have been brought to the Caribbean aboard Spanish ships, and in particular brought to the island of Jamaica, that you would see in the year 2021, a person being sworn in, not only, and many of these Indians who came, by the way, were either Hindu or were Muslims who were brought to the Caribbean. But it's not surprising that these African slaves who would have come hearing the first voice in their ear 503 years ago being a voice of people who were speaking Spanish, because they later ran away after the British took over into the mountains and became the nascent Maroon community. It's not surprising that 503 years later, a descendant of both Indians and these African slaves would ascend to the height of being the second most powerful person in the free world, and Kamala Harris as the Vice President of the United States of America. But all of these accomplishments and all of these achievements would not have happened had it not been for Islam and for the driving force that it gave to all of these civil rights leaders in sturdying their resolve, giving them an underpinning and an understanding of the importance of the fact that Blacks were not greater than any other race, or greater than any other cultural group, but that we were equal to these groups. And so they had a firm understanding of that. So when the Black Lives Matter movement surfaced, and we saw after the death of George
Dr.
Floyd.
Hemming, you have 1 minute. 1 minute.
Thank you. And we saw after the death of George Floyd, the coalition that came together of many different races and many different religious backgrounds. It's not surprising that all of this really pins itself back to Islam and to that 20% of Africans who were brought here to the United States in 1690, who were already practitioners of Islam. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Dr. Hemming. I could listen to you all day. I can see you're not only a judge, but a great preacher. I'm gonna go to your church one day, sir. All right, now we have the last panelist, Imam Dr. Nasser Ahmed. He's the Imam of Al-Ansar Mosque. Imam Ahmed's talk will reflect on the significant impact of South Florida's African-American Muslims and the iconic Al-Ansar Mosque on the struggle for racial justice. Imam Ahmed, you have the floor. Your microphone is mute, sir. Check your microphone. Thank you.
Okay, is that better now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right, my apology. With the name of God, the merciful benefactor, the merciful redeemer, I thank you, Dr. Alvarez and Dr. Mishbah, for this wonderful invitation. And I would like to begin by saying that we had two struggles in this country from the African-American perspective. The first was the Nation of Islam. Long before any other movement, there was, national now, effort. And later came the effort of the civil rights. And I think it's important to make a differentiation here. In the Nation of Islam, I was in the Nation of Islam and also under Elijah Muhammad and under his son. So I was blessed to have the two experiences. And in the time of Elijah Muhammad, we appreciated the movement of the civil rights workers who came much later after his great efforts. But we felt that the language, civil rights, was limited. So our greatest impact was in language, and we were concerned to try to elevate the thinking from civil rights to human rights, because civil rights was limited to the United States. We couldn't solicit help globally from other persons who would be interested. And so we felt that the better term for us would be human rights. And we have this particular situation as it relates to the physical body. You know, when we're pregnant in our mother's womb, we need a uterus to develop in. And so likewise, the human mind, it has to have a womb for it to develop in, and it develops in a language environment. So the Nation of Islam saw the United States at that time was an oppressive language environment that was much more dangerous than any bullets that you could shoot into anybody's physical body. And I hope that I'm explaining myself so that you can see the specific contribution that was made by Muslims. The works here in South Florida began in the 50s. And it was starting in the houses of certain persons, and then it moved from various storefronts. It moved into 7th Avenue area in Liberty City. And finally, the mosque, the masjid that you see now, it was purchased in this 1966-67 academic year. And the mosque and the school has been open for about 52 years, that physical building. But the movement of the religion began much, much earlier than that. And the concern that we had was we wanted to have more of a demonstration as well as the explanation that was coming from the civil rights brothers. We saw them as our brothers, as we see the two legs on a body. a right and a left leg. So you had the civil rights movement, and you had the movement of the Nation of Islam, as I said, the human rights movement. And we saw that the racism that we see today was driven by the same devious mind of the past that did not care which race bought the lie, as long as the lie stayed in existence to keep the masses of people at each other's throat. In the Nation of Islam, though we use the term black, and it really didn't come from us, it came from, oh my goodness, I can't think of this great Christian teacher. Oh, it'll come to me. And anyway, he was the one that coined black Muslims. We never called ourselves black. C. Eric Lincoln was the one who coined us black Muslims, and it was picked up after that particular time. Before that, we were just Muslims, international Muslims, as Dr. Knight had mentioned. And what our concern was at the time was to raise the knowledge of our people. We didn't see ourselves necessarily as black per se. You know, that was just something to bring respect to the physical anatomy that we were cast in by nature. But for us, the identity, even in the days of the Nation of Islam, was a mind. We never saw ourselves as this black physical flesh, but we saw ourselves then, as all human beings should see themselves now, as a thinking being. And that was the greatest struggle that we had, is to bring that consciousness into our people, because color had become a prison. You know, if you take medicine for a period of time, you get well. But if you continue to take the medicine then will become the source of a new sickness. So our movement was the movement for freedom, but we would ask the question, what is the purpose for the freedom, of which many people couldn't ask, you know? And we would try to get our people to understand that this purpose was to bring about better usage of our potential, of which was enslaved. Not so much the physical body. Yes, the physical body was enslaved, but more importantly was the enslavement of the man's mind, the enslavement of the person's aspiration, the enslavement of the drives. And so because of this, during that period, the Nation of Islam, we established over 200 schools throughout the United States, businesses all throughout the United States. So our contribution was a model, a community model for the rest of the African-American community. You know, we had schools, we had restaurants all over the United States at the time when we could hardly find employment in this country. And so along with the good speech was the good reality. Schools, homes, apartment buildings, et cetera, you know, at the time of this great oppression. And the other thing that we addressed was this race consciousness as it was created or invented for the racial dominance of one race over another. But our emphasis was that really the issue wasn't black or white. The issue was power. And it was difficult to get our people to see, as it is difficult now for many African Americans to see, that it is not about being black or white. It is to keep you out of power, keep you out of wealth, keep you out of economics. That is the real issue. And race is used as a convenient tool for the manipulators to maintain their status. Because if the majority of the people come into this understanding that I'm expressing to you now, then what will happen is that those people who fill the world with their minds become the leaders. And those people who fill the world with the numbers of their bodies become the new modern economic slaves. So this has been the trick that color has been used to keep us blind to get our share of real power and real wealth. And so our biggest contribution, I would say, is to awaken the thinking in the African American community. You know, if you fall down in the street and you want a black man, he'll come and start maybe doing a CPR on you and doing it around your neck. But he's black. But he's black and he'll kill you. Why? Because he doesn't have knowledge. Same thing with white men. You fall down in the street, the white man, if he doesn't have knowledge, he'll do CPR at your throat, he'll kill you. So the real identity of the
Mom,
yes,
Mom, sorry, you have 1 minute. 1 minute.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. So the real identity of the person, really for us, our contribution is to get the person to see that you are deeper than your concrete, that your reality is your abstract. Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you, Mom. Okay, we're gonna have about 5 or 6 minutes, maybe 10 at the most, so that the panelists can address each other, questions that you might have to each other, and then we'll open it to the general audience for questions.
Yes, sir.
Excuse me. Those in the audience that are listening and listening to the panelists, you can submit your questions through your chat. So go to right, it says chat, click chat on your Zoom below, and then you can send your questions. I believe you can also send your questions to the panelists through to your Facebook, if you're watching us through Facebook as well. Okay, so panelists, I'm not going to go in any order, but you've heard the other panelists. Any concerns that or questions that you might have to each other? So this is your time.
I would like to ask a question of the Imam, if I could.
Sure.
So I'm always humbled as an academic who studies things in a certain amount of textual abstraction to have the opportunity to learn from someone who has not only the textual materials but also the lived experience of these traditions. And so to the Imam, I would ask about the ways in which, because you had experienced the community's trajectory under the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and his son, if you could say some things about ways that Imam Mu'addin either extended the sense of global consciousness from his father, ways that he departed from his father in that, ways that he built upon what his father had given. So continuities and, I guess, developments.
Yes, sir. Well, I thank you for your contribution. You had my eyes open and my ears wide open. And if I help you in any way I possibly can. But in the Nation of Islam, we were told that the black man is the original man, okay? And so we were left with that. But the Honorable Elijah Muhammad told us that the answers are underneath what you are getting. So we were given lessons like that. And we just didn't have the insights, but it was Imam Muhammad that gave us the insight. And he told us every man is a black man, or every man is the original man, meaning that black meant not color, but it meant nature. When the person goes to sleep, they go to sleep in blackness. That kind of language. You put a seed in the ground, you put it in blackness. So it didn't mean color, it meant potential to bring out life. And so he expounded on the teachings of his father to help us to be universal in a manner such as that. So he said every human being, for example, is born the original man, meaning that he comes in the world with the original nature and direction from the womb. No human being, male or female, black or white, comes here as a liar, as a thief, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They come here with innocence and purity. It is the deception in the world that comes into that body that makes them otherwise. Just like a car doesn't rob the bank. It's the driver that gets in the car that goes to the bank and robs the bank. So likewise it is with the human being. It is not the flesh that does wrong. It is the thinking that comes in the mind that's the driver of the flesh to do the wrong. I'm trying to be as quick and as fast as I can because I know we got some bright people on this panel, and I was just enjoying our dear young lady, professor. She, and I'm trying to get out of her way because I see her spirit. I can feel her spirit. And Judge Hemming, he's just as natural as he always is. I enjoy him every time I hear him. I agree with the rest of you. So I just wanted to say that.
If I may interject, the people that are watching, when they ask questions, I said use the chat room, but no, there's a function called question and answer. So you can use that as well. You can use both the chat or the question and answer to ask questions of the panelists. Any other panelists want to, one more comment amongst each other's, reply to each other? We just heard Dr. Knight address the Imam. Any questions? Dr. Chaudhry, any one of you want to respond before we turn it over and ask to the audience to ask general questions? Go ahead.
If I may ask to the law professor, so in the 49th surah, in the 13th verse of the Quran, it says, "O mankind, indeed we have created you from male and female and made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another." What in terms of the equality that seems to be at the foundation of Islam, how has that impacted the scholarship in terms of the cases that we've seen, especially in light of the two cases that you identified, Shelley versus Kramer and Smith versus Allwright?
So I think one of the interesting things about these cases, first of all, there's no real connection to Islam in any of these cases, in that they were brought by people who were not Muslims, but in fact, we don't know what religion they are. They may have very well have been, but we don't know. But one way of thinking about it is through the lens of this particular verse that you just cited. And I have always understood this verse to mean and to demonstrate the beauty of diversity and the plan behind diversity and the equality of different tribes and peoples and men and women, and not a hierarchy. That this is a sign that is given to us of the magnificence, the bounty, the beauty of creation, and not that we have created these differences in order for one to be above the other, etc., etc. And we have had conversations about gender hierarchies, etc., etc., and there's been a lot more thinking about that. But when we think about that idea and we think about these civil rights cases, these civil rights cases are a sort of an embodiment of that very concept of living together in diversity and equality, and that we do not have to become something else in order to be accepted as equal and to be accepted as valuable and important in and of ourselves. And so I think that it is it's both a constitutional norm that we continue to realize, if you think about it as a process and not as something that just sort of happens and is over. We are constantly becoming more equal, more accepting, more tolerant. I think this is very much in keeping with notions of equality and tolerance in Islam.
We have questions for the panelists from the audience. Isabel Duque asks, love the idea of development of the mind and the safety of a womb. How can this be best achieved, nourished for people of color? The panelists, you understood the question? Want me to repeat it? Anyone want to take it in the panel? Let me read it again. I love the idea. This is from Isabel Duque. Love the idea of development of the mind in the safety of a womb. How can this best be achieved or nourished for people of color?
Okay, the classroom is the extension of the womb. And in the, in the womb of the mother, there are many, many different eggs. Each egg has a potential to be a different child. So the same thing happens in the womb is to happen in the classroom or in the field of education. That there are different minds, number of minds that are in a classroom setting. And the only thing that will help us is the one truth. Like for a woman, when she's pregnant, she could be pregnant with 2 children or 4 children, but they all have to have one oxygen in order for all of them to thrive and to develop into a full body. So likewise it is in the classroom. The classroom has to have universal truth that is given to each potential mind that's in that classroom, and that we would be guaranteed the product. And I want to, please let me say this. Please let me say this. That verse that Judge Hemming referred to in the Quran, the verses, the diversity is speaking to us like the wheels on your car. You have 4 wheels on your car. Each one is in a different, diverse position. One at the front right, front left, back left, right? But those positions of diversity guarantees the forward progress of that vehicle. So therefore, as Dr. Chaudhry said, she is saying, I'm saying the same thing she said, that it is the fact that we are in different places that we gain knowledge. And then we are to bring that knowledge together from the different parts of the world to raise up humanity as one whole. If we were all in the Garden of Eden, we'd be dumb and naked right now. But because we have gone, excuse me, I don't mean to be so gross. Maybe Dr. Chaudhry, you forgive me. I forgot you were a woman here. I thought it was all guys on the panel. But because we have been in different places, we have benefited from the knowledge, and that's the wisdom in this Quran. That's one of the meanings of it. So thank you, District Chaudhry. I'm gonna have to give you royalties on your interpretation. I love that. I'm gonna give that in my next khutbah tomorrow.
Okay, I have another question here it's also for the Imam. Have you, Imam, had any? This is from an anonymous attendee. Have you, Imam, have any incidences of anti-Black racism within the Muslim community in South Florida, especially from immigrant Muslims? And if so, how have you dealt with them?
Yes, I have had that. And it lasted about maybe 15 seconds because the person who addressed me was a devout Muslim. I mean, he really respected the religion, but sometimes we forget. So I reminded him, I told him, Muhammad the Prophet said there's no superiority of the Arab over the non-Arab, the black over the white over the black. And then I told him that the first muezzin, the one to call all the Muslims to prayer, was not an Arab, he was a black man. And Prophet Muhammad chose him to call all of the Arabs together for prayer. And so he ended up being one of my best friends, you know what I mean? So, it's just like a virus. We catch a cold, right? I'm around, you around me, I have a cold, I sneeze, you're gonna get it. You know what I'm saying?
Okay, another question. This is from Muhammad. I think he's one of my students, by the way. Muhammad is right now in Kuwait, listening to us and participating in this. Yes. The question from Muhammad is, my question is to Dr. Nasser, does the media, and I think this is for all of you, by the way, and I think maybe Dr. Chaudhry, perhaps you could address this as well. Does the media historically have a role in marginalizing and victimizing African Americans in the United States?
I can answer that. I mean, absolutely. We have enormous amounts of scholarship and work that has been done on the media's role in propagating anti-Black and, in fact, anti-minority, viewpoints across the board. So it's not just, I mean, for the Black community has been the longest and the most sustained sort of victim of media, biased media portrayals of criminality, of biased reporting with regards to sort of anything that happens in those communities. but also Muslims, if you watch any sort of movie, Muslims are invariably negatively portrayed. Latinos are not portrayed fairly either. So yes, I don't know what more there's to really say is about this, but absolutely we have lots and lots of documentation about the negative portrayals of minorities and of African Americans particularly.
Professor
Yeah,
Alvarez, Professor Alvarez, just consider me as an audience. I have a question.
Go ahead.
I'm going to abuse my status as a host and ask maybe a question. First, a comment about that famous surah and the chapter in the Quran. There is an extension to that because I teach a class in Islam and politics, and whenever I get to that section in my class, the students don't let me go, and they want to have a discussion, and it drags me into the following week. I think the follow-up to the end of that specific ayah is that the idea that the best of you in my eyes is the one who is most pious,
right.
which is a reference to the real trouble. And that is the real trouble of humanity in its nature, perhaps. And this is an ontological and philosophical questions about the constitution of a nature, something called nature of human being. The preoccupation with the status. And how the preoccupation with status become the foundation for discrimination and fear also. In other words, yes, you come from the same origin, you're not superior, but you are preoccupied with superiority. And that preoccupation is foundation, and that is a foundation of philosophizing about power, preoccupation with power and status, hegemony, dominations, pride, and so on. I think that is a very important issue to see how race and achievement of race have become foundation for establishing and processing, textualizing, and teaching superiority. And then question that superiority is actually foundational to dismantling this whole infrastructure of the belief in superiority of certain people or countries or races and so on. So that was my sort of side comments for the judge in terms of that particular origin. My question is for Syra and maybe for others. It has become gradually common to talk about Muslims as race. And the idea that this framing of Muslimness as a racial category and losing Islam as a religion, actually, and making it into a particular category of people. Syra can comment on that. I think Michael and others, if you want to just comment on that framing that seems to be pretty much effective, actually, both in Europe, in the United States, and so on. And that is why many Muslims who are not actually even practicing Muslims, they pride themselves as being non-practicing and secular. Because their name is Muhammad, their name is Abdullah, then they come from Egypt or whatever, they're almost been sucked into this category already, you know. So if anybody wants to comment on that.
Well, I just spent an hour talking to the Tulane faculty about my recent research on that's called Law, Islamophobia, and the Racialization of Religion. So it's something that I've been working on for some time and thinking about. And you know, there is a easy way of sort of just equating Muslims with and Islam with race, but I think that we have to think carefully about what it is that is creating this link between race and Muslims. And in the United States experience versus Europe's experience, you know, these are not necessarily exactly the same. In the United States, as we heard from Michael and the Imam, early Islam was actually very much linked to African Americans, and it was not it was nothing but a religion followed by people of color. And we have actually lots of case law in that shows this as well. Whiteness and Christianity were conflated with each other, and Muslims, blackness, brownness were conflated with each other. And so if you think about Islam itself, the religion as a non-white religion, one way to think about Muslims as a racial category or a raced category, a subject that has become raced in some way, is to think about the process by which that has happened through the connection to Islam. So this explains to you why even white Muslims who have the external characteristics of being a Muslim. For instance, if you are a blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman, but you wear hijab, you are going to have some racial profiling that comes along with your external vestiges of being a Muslim. Same with white male Muslims. If you're carrying a prayer rug, you know, if you don't think that this is correct, get one of your friends to carry a Quran and a prayer rug and wear a kufi in the airport and see what happens. You know, it's this connection of the religion to race that is a long history that stretches back to times of slavery, in fact, and we have increasingly more scholarship on this that links, sort of provides that racial link. It's productive in the sense of, you know, there's a vocabulary for talking about racial discrimination. And there's a vocabulary for talking about equality that that we can sort of piggyback on as Muslims. And of course, for African-American Muslims, who are 20% of our Muslim community, there is no distinction. I mean, they're you know, they're at the intersection of race and Islam, as are those of us who are clearly brown. So for us, we have this it's religion times race, right? And sometimes these things come together to amplify each other. So, you know, it is productive in some respects to talk about Muslims as a race when that is they are actually triggering a racial response, right? When Muslims trigger a racial response from the state or from other people. So it, you know, that makes sense. Does it always make sense? In some contexts, perhaps not, right? In some contexts, Muslims as a race, certainly intra-Muslim racial dynamics are separate from the religious dynamic, I think. So, you know, one has to think about that. I don't know if that helps, if that answers the question, Muhyiddin.
No, I think it does, but I'm also concerned about, and this is something that the Jafar Center is very preoccupied with, and I've talked to you about this before, that these gradations of racism that even exists within the Muslim community versus the African Americans. And this has been my preoccupation, to take the education not only to the rest of the society, but also to immigrant community. And this adaptation of the certain degrees of the whiteness as a superior race, as superior achievers. I think it's an important categorization that the race becomes an adapted category. Mm-hmm. And therefore, you gradate yourself vis-a-vis others who are below you. And that is why the significance of that ayah and that surah in the Quran, that the preoccupation with the status is the fundamental disease. And that's a warning in that Quranic verse, that you're coming from the same place, but don't be too preoccupied with your status. And I think this is something that I see even among the immigrant community coming to the United States. I talk about myself personally. It's still, I've been here for 40 years, and I still do not understand the racism against the African Americans. I can't.
Well, really, actually, if you think about it, and you know, I'd be interested to hear other people's view on this. But you know, the fact is that when you come to this country as an immigrant, you are expected to assimilate into a dominant white culture. So even historically, when Muslims were immigrating into the United States, you look at the immigration cases from the 1940s, and you had to argue, either you had to argue that you were white or you were black in order to gain naturalization or citizenship in the United States. So, for example, Bhagat Singh, Thind, Osawa, there's a whole bunch of Morias, these cases that are essentially immigration cases at the Supreme Court level. People were arguing that we are actually white. One was a Japanese, one was a Sikh, Indian dude, clearly not white. Another was, a Syrian. And so this court had to determine who was white, because only white people or black people, because of slavery, were allowed to come into the United States and apply for citizenship. Some South Asians came in and argued that they were black, right? So they actually managed to come in that way. But the propulsion, right, the impetus has been to assimilate with and to try to become as white as possible, because whiteness in this country has all the benefits. It's the gold standard of all the rights and all the protections, etc. Right? So on some level, what you are taught when you come to this country is don't be like blacks. And if you, as we have talked, and you'll see that every time you put me on a panel, my tendency is to try to make immigrant communities understand that they don't have these rights because somebody just decided to wake up one morning and give them these rights. They have these rights because of a long, protracted, brutal, violent struggle on the part of African Americans to make people more equal. They didn't just inherit these rights. These rights were fought for, bought, and paid for by people who died and who are black. So the idea that we should now consider them, somehow inferior is unacceptable, and it should be resisted, challenged, and changed at every opportunity that we have.
Well, folks, this has been an incredibly powerful panel discussion. I want to thank the panelists, by the way, for your contribution to what we have done here today. And I think all of you will leave an indelible mark in our memories about what has happened here. There were other questions I know that people wanted to ask. I wanted to ask a question to Dr. Knight about retrieving the heritage of the Nation of Islam, and also to the judge about Black nationalism, Marcus Garvey. I mean, you brought out the Jamaican heritage in Malcolm X, and Marcus Garvey is a major force, I believe, in the Nation of Islam. We don't have more time, but Moeddin Misbahi, the director, you have the last word. We need to do this again, Moeddin.
We started last year at the Al Ansar Mosque. I've known the Imam since I was a student. I gave a lecture in his mosque when I was a student. Yeah. And this is going to be one of the key preoccupation of the Jafar Center. And hopefully next year, we could have a larger conference in person, inshallah, out of COVID, and invite the same panels and others to participate in this process of self-education and also mutual education, inshallah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. The panel discussion is over. Thank you for attending.
Thank you very much.
Inshallah, we'll see you again.
Thank you. Peace be unto you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Saira.
Thank you.
Thanks, Moeddin.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Judge.
Michael.
Yes.
Thank you.